There is a fascinating comment that is featured in this past week's Parsha, Parshas Vayishlach. It's one of the most interesting, maybe troubling, perplexing, and baffling comments, perhaps, in all of Rashi's commentary on the Torah. There's 5,845 verses in the Torah. Most of them have comments in Rashi, and this one is perhaps the hardest one to understand. Jacob had spent 20 years at the home of Laban, and he now is at the helm of a dynasty. He has 4 wives. He has 11 sons. He has a daughter, Dina, and he's heading back to Canaan, to the land of his forefathers, to Isaac, but also to Esau. Esau, his twin brother, is very upset at him, even though the events that triggered his enmity are more than 30 years in the past. Nevertheless, he's still hopping mad, and he still has murderous intentions. And the Parsha really begins by talking about Jacob's preparations for his fateful encounter with his twin brother. He sends the messengers. He gives very specific messages to convey to Esau. He sends a very lavish gift. He's trying to butter him up, to bribe him a little bit. He prepares for war. He prays. He has a showdown with Esau's angel, we're told. And finally, the fateful moment has arrived. He's going to meet Esau. He encounters him. He bows down 7 times. He expresses great deference for his brother. And they hug and they kiss, and all's well. And the other children come and they bow down, and it seems like Esau's rage has been quelled. And then he says, well, let's get together. Let's spend time together. And Jacob says, no, you go and I'll catch up to you eventually. Rashi says, well, that's going to be times of Messiah. So this is how Jacob skirted disaster with his reunion with his brother. But right before the encounter, the verse says, this is chapter 32, verse 23. So 3-2, 2-3, easy to remember in the book of Genesis. Jacob got up at that night, and he took his 2 wives and his 2 maidservants, that's his 4 wives in total, and his 11 children, and he crossed over the river Yabok. So he's about to encounter Esau. He has his family, his 4 wives, his 11 children, and they cross over the river Yabok. That's right before he meets Esau. And Rashi does some basic math for us and says, wait a minute. Jacob has not 11 children. He has 12 children, 11 sons and 1 daughter. Someone is conspicuously missing. Why does the verse say that Jacob's taken his 11 children? He has 12. That is the question that Rashi asks. And it's actually a midrash, as we shall see. And Rashi explains that Jacob had 11 sons and 1 daughter. And he was worried that Esau had a penchant for taking beautiful women. And he didn't want Esau to lay his eyes on his daughter, because he thought that maybe Esau would snatch her. So he took his daughter Dina and he placed her in a box. He hid her in a box. I'm sure they punctured some holes so she could breathe. And he locked it in order to prevent her from being taken by Esau. And thus, he's taken his 11 children, because the 12th one is not present really in a visible way. She's hidden in the box with some holes punctured and maybe some water until we get past Esau. Why? Because if she's exposed, well, then Esau's going to say, she's going to be my wife. And of course, Jacob did not want that. Which father of a daughter would want Esau as a son-in-law? He's not exactly what we're looking for. So he, quite prudently, we imagine, he did what any responsible parent would do. Esau's a loose cannon. Let's hide Dina. He put her in a box, and he locked the box, and he only met Esau only met Jacob, his 4 wives, and his 11 sons. But Dina, she was hiding out in the box. They successfully navigate this encounter, bows down 7 times. Esau's emotions are overwhelmed with positive feelings towards his brother, and they hug and they kiss, and eventually go their separate ways, and they open up the box, and Dina is once again brought out. That's what Rashi tells us. Now, if this is where Rashi stopped, I would say, okay, Jacob made a good decision. He made an appropriate decision. He prevented his daughter from being taken. And once the danger has passed, Dina could come out of the box. But Rashi continues and says this was a mistake that Jacob made. And he was punished for this mistake. He should, apparently, at least the simple reading of Rashi, he should have taken his daughter and have her out. And if Esau would lay his eyes upon her and want to marry her, well, maybe she should marry him. Because what would happen if Esau married Dina? Well, Dina, she would influence him. And she would transform him. And she would restore him to proper behavior. And because he withheld his daughter from his brother, she could have saved him. She could have influenced him to repent. Oh, you don't want your daughter to fall in the hands of Esau? She's going to fall in the hands of Shechem. And later on in the Parsha, it says, Shechem, the heir of the city of Shechem, he saw Dina, and he grabbed her, and he assaulted her, and he wanted to marry her. And that ended up quite poorly for him. If you read the end of the story, he gets deceived by the sons of Jacob. We'll intermarry with you. No problem. You can have Dina. Just you have to circumcise. You and everyone in the city, which they do dutifully. And day 3 of the circumcision, everyone's in bed, everyone is in pain. And Shimon and Levi take their arms, take their swords, and slaughter the entire city. But still, Dina was violated, and Rashi says Jacob was punished because he withheld his daughter from Esau. Oh, you don't want her to be in the hands of Esau? It'll end up way, way, way worse. Shechem is way worse. And the Midrash that Rashi is citing over here, the Midrash says, well, Esau is bad, but at least he's circumcised. At least he's part of this family. Shechem's way worse. Had she married Esau, it would have been in a permissible fashion. Well, now she ended up with Shechem in an impermissible fashion. This is the comment in Rashi. Now, it's very baffling, as we shall see. We'll break it down. But I want to just start with some basic calculation. Everyone loves calculation on a Sunday. Some math on a Sunday. And I always say that math really translates well to audio. You're listening to the math and you don't get to see it on the board. It really works out. But we'll do some basic calculation. Because there's a nice idea here. It's a side point. So if you want to skip this idea and just zone out for a little bit for the math, I'll wake you up when the math is over. The verse says that Jacob took his 11 children. And Rashi says, well, where was Dina? Well, if it's 11 children, one's missing, how does Rashi know, how does the Midrash know that it is Dina who is missing? Maybe it's one of the sons. The verse just says that there's 11 children present with Jacob, and we know that there are 12, so one of them must be missing. And Rashi assumes, the Midrash assumes, that it must be Dina. Who is to say maybe it was one of the sons of Jacob that was missing? So the Gaon of Vilna has a nice calculation where he cites the sages who note that the temple was built in the tribal lands of Benjamin. Once the Jews conquered the land, Joshua and so on, they divided up the land into 12 tribal portions. And the tribal portion of Benjamin, that's the tribal portion that has the temple in it. And it was actually, shaped almost like a gerrymandered state map. You've seen those. Just the most outrageously shaped districts. It was kind of shaped like that, the first gerrymander. Because Jerusalem was all in the tribal lands of Judah. And Benjamin has this little sliver that cuts through the land of Joshua to include the temple. So it was designed specifically that the whole surrounding is the tribal lands of Judah, but the temple grounds itself is in the lands of Benjamin. And why did Benjamin merit to have the temple grounds in his ancestral tribal lands? So our sages tell us, because when there was this reunion with Esau, and Jacob bowed down 7 times in front of his brother. And all of his sons, who were alive at the time, they also bowed down to Esau. If you bow down to Esau, even if you have to do it to save your life, you have to really show deference and honor to Esau, because otherwise he'll slaughter you all. But still, you bow down to Esau, you're not worthy to host the temple. There was one son of Jacob who was not born at the time. That is Benjamin. And therefore, we know that Benjamin did not bow down to Esau. He wasn't alive. And therefore, he's the only one who is worthy to have the temple in his tribal lands. That's what our sages tell us. Accordingly, we know for sure that the 11 sons who were alive at the time, they must have all been out of the box. They must have all been present in this rendezvous, in this reunion of Jacob and Esau. And thus it must be that Dina was the one who was missing. By the way, just a little side note or an epilogue to that story. One of the most famous descendants of Benjamin is actually Mordechai from the Purim story. And Mordechai does not bow down to Haman. Haman's the descendant of Esau. And Mordechai is the descendant of Benjamin. And the reason, the rationale, and the strength that Mordechai had to not bow down when everyone else was bowing down to Haman, he said, listen, everyone else bows down to Haman because they set a precedent. All the other tribes, there's a precedent. They bow down to Esau. I never bow down because I am part of the tribe of Benjamin, and therefore I have the strength to not capitulate, to not yield, to not succumb to the strength, to the forces, to the influence of Esau. I will not bow. I will not prostrate myself. Okay, that's the math. Math is over. Dina was the one who was missing of the 12 children. Dina was the one who was missing. And she was placed in a box for a very prudent reason, we're told. Esau would go after her. Jacob says, that's intolerable. I'm going to hide her away. He hid her in a box. He locked the box. Once the danger passed, he opened the box. But apparently, he made a mistake. And he was punished for it. And this is such a baffling comment in Rashi. All the commentators in Rashi, they all say, what is going on over here? How can anyone suggest that Jacob made a mistake? Esau, one of the worst villains of all time. And he's coming now with the intention of killing Jacob. And it's only the mastery and the maneuvering of Jacob that prevented catastrophe. Esau was coming with the intention of slaughtering everyone. He's an unrepentant rascal, a wicked man. The last thing we want is to have Esau marry our daughter. And Rashi is suggesting that maybe Jacob should have kept Dina exposed, because maybe she'll marry him, and when she marries him, she'll influence him and bring him back to proper behavior. And for this, Jacob is punished? It's such a crazy idea that Rashi is conveying to us. And I think there's a few different points here that are worthy of inquiry. One idea is that our sages are telling us that there was a chance to save Esau. And specifically, had he married Dina, she could have changed him. That's fascinating idea number one. Idea number two is that Jacob made a mistake on some level. A mistake for which he is judged and punished for. So let's unpack what's going on over here and share some ideas. Because if this is what our sages are telling us, there's something very important for us to learn and to glean. Esau was a veteran sinner. The first thing we're told about Esau is that he was ruddy. He was admoni. He was red. Now, what's the significance of that? Rashi tells us it's a simon, it's a sign that he will be a bloodshedder. He was destined to no good from the very beginning, even before he was born. We know there were jostling and tussling inside of her. Every time Rebekah passed the house of idolatry, well, Esau was stirred. He was awakened. He was aroused. He wanted to be born to do idolatry. And he went awry. And the day that really pushed him over the edge was the day that Abraham died. Abraham died. And Jacob is making the traditional bereavement food of the lentils. And Esau returns from the field and he's tired. The Torah is not telling us that Esau didn't sleep. He had insufficient REM sleep. There's no discussion in the Torah about REM sleep. If the Torah tells us someone is tired, it means they're spiritually exhausted. Their spiritual powers have left them. They're spiritually tired. The Talmud tells us on that day, and the Talmud proves it, Esau committed 5 of the most grievous of sins. He raped a married woman. He murdered. He committed heresy. He rejected the veracity of the resurrection. And he embarrassed, he humiliated the spiritual birthright. Just as an aside, another aside, who was the person that Esau murdered on that day? The person he murdered was actually Nimrod, our sages tell us. Remember Nimrod? The mighty warrior from Parshas Noach. Nimrod was the monarch who threw Abraham into the fiery furnace. And that's the day that he was murdered, and the special garments that he had were taken by Esau. And those are the same special garments that Esau gave his mother to watch for him. And those are the same garments that she gave to Jacob to go impersonate him when he came to usurp the blessings. Nimrod was murdered by Esau. But who else died on that same day, the commentaries observe? The same day that Abraham died, Nimrod died. And that's not a coincidence. Because these were 2 complete arch nemeses who each represented a different system, a different ideology, a different value system, a different belief. Nimrod was the greatest idolater of his time, and Abraham, of course, is the greatest teacher of faith of his time. And it has to be they died on the same day. Because a world that has a Nimrod but no Abraham will be so skewed in one direction, it would destroy the balance, the necessary balance that has to be in place. A world with Abraham but no Nimrod would also be a world that is wobbly, asymmetric, unbalanced. So it has to be that they both died on the same day. This is Esau as a teenager. You do the math. More math. Wow. More math on a Sunday. Abram was 100 when Isaac was born. Well, Isaac was 60 when Jacob and Esau were born. So Abram is 160. And Abram died at 175. Accordingly, Jacob and Esau were 15 when Abraham died. So Esau at 15 is murdering and raping and committing the worst, most unconscionable sins and rejecting the foundational beliefs of Abraham. And you want him to marry your daughter? With a resume like that? You want to marry your daughter? And he didn't repent. This is 15, and he continued his sinful ways until this point. He's someone who is snatching women, or sages tell us. He was a serial rapist. He had volcanic rage. And he's meeting Jacob with murderous intent. And the influences that he has around him are all bad. He married 3 women, we read. And Isaac became blind. One of the reasons that our sages tell us is because the incense that his wives, that Esau's wives, they burned incense to idolatry in his house. So Esau is a good for nothing. He's a dangerous person. Yet, we learn he was still salvageable. Had he married Dina, there's a chance, our sages tell us, that he could have completely repented. So I think the first fascinating idea from this Rashi is that no matter how far someone may be, Esau is called universally Esau Harasha, the wicked one. And that description is justly earned. Nevertheless, we see over here that he could have repented. He was still salvageable. Now, my grandfather, blessed memory, used to cite a teaching in the Midrash to explain how Dina could have brought Esau back. The Midrash tells a story of a righteous man who married a righteous woman. Amazing. Righteous on both sides. Pious people. Wonderful. A wonderful couple. But unfortunately, they were infertile. So there must have been some sort of mismatch. They couldn't have any children. And they made a decision that they should separate. Because they understood that Hashem wants them to have children, and if this is just not a union that will bring about children, well, let's try some other unions. So indeed, they get divorced. And they each married someone else. And the righteous man married a wicked woman, and the righteous woman married a wicked man. And the Midrash tells us what happened. The righteous man, he followed his new wife, and he became wicked because of her. Whereas the other couple, the opposite happened. The wicked man who married the righteous woman, the wicked man was transformed. He became righteous. Concludes the Midrash, the woman, she influences the direction, the trajectory of a house. If she's righteous, she'll bring even a wicked husband with her. Whereas if she's wicked, she'll corrupt even a righteous husband. So my grandfather, blessed memory, used to cite this Midrash as the explanation, perhaps, of how Dina would influence Esau. Yes, he's wicked. But so what? She has the ability. She has outsized ability as his would-be wife, as his counterfactual wife, to influence him and to bring him back to righteousness. Now, more specifically, we can suggest that Dina is the daughter of Jacob. It's not just a generic wife has influence over a generic husband. She, perhaps, as the daughter of Jacob, she would have the ability, outsized ability, to influence Esau. And I think it's interesting, if you look at the end of her story, she meets a guy named Shem. Another another sinful soul. And there's this terrible interaction that they have. But then Shem becomes infatuated and obsessed with her. And he's willing to do anything to marry her. He wants to circumcise himself. What does it mean to circumcise? It means to adopt everything that Abraham stood for. It's not just to do some sort of surgery. That's what it ended up being, right? But his commitment to change himself is manifested in the fact that he's saying, I'm willing to adopt everything that Abraham stood for. So we have an example, a living example of the power of Dina to transform sinful men. Well, if she did that to Shem, she could have done that to Esau. And that adds another wrinkle, I think, in the commentary of Rashi, that Jacob is punished, we're told, because she ended up with Shem. It's actually pointing out her power, her specific power that she has. She can make Shem become righteous or want to become righteous. Well, she could have done that to Esau as well. So it's a fascinating idea. I think the first idea that I wanted to talk about over here, but let's go a little further. Did Jacob make a mistake? Rashi says he did. He took his daughter, put her in a box, locked it up, punched her some holes, I imagine, and withheld her from his brother. What should he have done? There's a monster who has a penchant for snatching women. And has a very long history of sinfulness. Who in their right mind would take their daughter and present her as a candidate to marry him? It seems absurd to suggest that we should take our daughters and say, let's find the worst, sinful, terrible person, the most brutish monster of them all. And she'll influence them properly. It seems outrageous to suggest that his mistake was that he did not marry her off to Esau. So all the commentaries talk about this, and they all suggest something of the same family of ideas. Even though Jacob's behavior, his preference to not have his daughter marry Esau was the correct outcome, the way he went about doing it was a bit problematic. You look at Rashi, and this is a source from the Midrash. He placed her in a box and he locked it. So some of the commentaries say, maybe he shouldn't have locked it. Place her in the box, but what's the need to lock it? To lock it means that you really want to lock out any possibility that she marries she marries Esau. And Jacob is not even thinking on the plane of, well, maybe, just maybe she could influence him. Jacob's only priority was the well-being of his daughter. He didn't even have like a dilemma. Maybe I should do this, or maybe I should do that. Maybe I should lock it, or maybe I shouldn't lock it. I should leave it open. And maybe she should marry him. Maybe that's the right thing, because maybe she should influence it. But no. Had Jacob made that calculation and concluded that the best thing is to hide her, then he would not be criticized. The criticism is only not in his behavior, but in the deliberations and the vacillations that led to his conclusion. Others say, well, he should have given a sigh and lamented the fact that he has to withhold Dina from Esau. He should have at least considered the fact that his brother could potentially benefit from marrying her, but alas, I have to hide her because that's the right thing to do. So this is, I think, an example of an idea that we find all over the literature. That the righteous are judged using a different yardstick, a different criteria than everyone else. The Talmud tells us in many places that the righteous are judged Kechut asayra, by the width of a hair's breadth. A hair not very wide. I don't know, was it half a millimeter? It's very thin. Depends. Some people have thick hair, some people have thin hair. But it's very, very, very subtle. The righteous are held to a higher standard, and they are judged in a different way than everyone else is. This is an example. This is an illustration of that principle. Jacob did the right thing. His behavior was 100% correct. And had he behaved some other way, he would have made a mistake. So where is the mistake? Not in the behavior, but in the calculations and deliberations that led to the behavior. The fact that he did not at all consider something as remote and outlandish as, well, maybe I can help my brother, who, by the way, is coming to kill you, right? Esau's coming to kill you right now, but still you should have, Jacob on his level, he should have considered and weighed the fact that maybe his brother could benefit from marrying Dina. This is an example of the righteous being judged in a different way. For us, if we did what Jacob did, it would be 100% mitzvah. Jacob on his level, the fact that he didn't have this slight sensitivity towards this very remote possibility that Dina would rectify Esau, that for Jacob is a sin that he is punished for. Now, my grandfather, when he talked about this angle of this Rashi, he said something absolutely marvelous. Why? Why are the righteous judged on a different standard? It's not fair. Everyone should be held to the same standard. No one is above the law. No one is below the law. The law should apply universally the same way to everyone at all times. So why is there a different standard for the righteous? So he said that the way judgment works is like this. Before a person dies, this is a very Kabbalistic idea, but it's well sourced. A person is given an accounting of every decision, every deed, every word, every thought that they had. The good ones and the bad ones. A complete accounting of their life. Is this accurate? Yes, and they sign off on it. This is the full accounting of their deeds of their lifetime. And after they die, there's a tribunal that they face. There's an accounting and a reckoning that they must undergo. And the result of that judgment will determine their fate. If they are lucky and righteous, they'll go to Gehenna. I always say that to trigger people, because what? Gehenna is a bad place. No, it's a very good place. The worst place is where a person, there could be even worse places, but the worst fate is where someone didn't accomplish what they need to accomplish, have to be sent back into the maelstrom of physical existence, which is not the worst, but one of the worst fates of the soul. Suppose they're righteous. Well, they just have a few sins that need to be cleansed and purified. They go to the Gehenna to have those addressed. And after 12 months, they go to Gan Eden, which is heaven, paradise, a good place to end up. But there are different levels of paradise. There's the lower level of paradise. And then there's the higher level of paradise. And there's a lot of levels in between. So once someone passes one realm of judgment, they graduate. So if someone ends up in Gehenna for 12 months, well, okay, now they're judged again to see whether or not they can advance to the lower level of paradise. And after they're there for 12 months, they are judged once again to see if they can move up a notch to a next higher level of paradise. But the nature of the judgment changes. For someone to graduate up a level, they have to be worthy of that level. And therefore, the judgment becomes more fine and more subtle and addressing the finer points of their choices, of their catalog of choices that they made. So something that they were judged in a previous realm, well, now that was a coarser judgment because that was a lower level. Now you graduate up a level. Well, the judgment now changes to see if you're worthy of that. So it gets more fine and more subtle. What does the judgment on the highest level look like? This is what it looks like. Jacob did 100% the right thing. 100% he made the right choice. Where's the mistake? Where's the mistake that Jacob did? There's not a single person in the world that anyone would advise, not the Torah and not anyone else, to say, take your daughter and present her as a candidate to marry Esau. Jacob did the right thing. So where's his mistake? His mistake is he should have maybe considered, he should have given a lament and a sigh, he should have maybe not locked it as intensely. And that's a judgment for Jacob on his level. And again, remember, Jacob's still alive. He's alive. He hasn't even begun this post-mortem of judgment. In his lifetime, he's already being judged, not on level 1 of judgment, but on this very, very high level of judgment, like a hair's breadth. Fine judgment on the most subtle decisions that a person could possibly make. So to me, this is an amazing illustration of this concept and the logic behind it. Why is it that someone who is more righteous is judged in a more fine-toothed comb in a more subtle way? It's because they are on a higher level, and thus the realm of judgment in that level is much, much more subtle. Jacob made the most slightest of mistakes. On his level, that is the level that is being judged, and that's what he should have accounted for. I find this Rashi to be fascinating because anyone who reads it, they're automatically troubled by it. First of all, how do we know that it's Dina? And how can we blame Jacob? And it's so baffling. You unpack it, you see some very valuable insights. But I want to take maybe a takeaway for us. Jacob made the right decision. No question. Jacob did not err in his choice of behavior to withhold Dinah from his brother. So where was his mistake? It was maybe on the consideration that he didn't consider the fact that he could have maybe helped his brother. That consideration is important to you. You see someone who is wicked, and if you could help them, you should help them. So why didn't Jacob help him? Because there's a downside. You have to give your daughter. The only way you can help him is to marry your daughter. Well, that's not responsible. But suppose there was no downside. Suppose there was a way. Imagine, but there isn't. But let's imagine there was. Suppose there's a way to help Esau improve, rectify, repent without endangering Dinah. If Jacob is being taken to task for the fact that he didn't bother, he didn't consider, he didn't worry at all about trying to help Esau, trying to reel Esau back to righteousness, and he's punished and he's criticized in this circumstance, meaning even though to help Esau would demand forfeiting his daughter to the brutish beast, nevertheless he is criticized. Imagine if there was no downside. Imagine how much more so he would be required to help Esau if there was no downside. So to me, one of the larger takeaways is the responsibility that Jacob had to help Esau. Esau's coming to kill you, but you could help him. If there was no downside to Dinah, then all the more so Jacob would be responsible to try to bring Esau back to righteousness. How many Esavs do we know? How many children of Abraham and Isaac and now Jacob do we know who have fallen away from the path and became distant from their Creator. This citation is telling us of the incredible importance and imperative to do whatever we can to help them repent. Now again, if it demands giving up your daughter, only Jacob is really criticized that he didn't consider that. But what if there's no downside? What if you could help the Esavs in your life without risking anything on your own? Then there's no question. They have to do whatever you can. So I think this is perhaps a clarion call for us to do whatever we can to help any Esav that we know come back to righteousness. Esau is a son of Isaac. He's a grandson of Abraham. Think about just what that means. He's a grandson of Abraham. Abraham will change the whole world, brings the whole world back to righteousness. And his own grandson goes awry. His parents are Isaac and Rebekah, two of the greatest people of all time. And for some reason, Esau goes astray. There are many Esavs all around us. What percentage of descendants of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob today are guilty of some of Esav-like behavior? Who have started to behave in ways that are very much distant from the ways of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. If we can do anything to help them, we are required to do so. And I will tell you something a little scary that you're not going to like at all. I'm going to say it anyhow because it's the truth. There's an idea that is accepted, and there's sources for it, and we can go through this. Maybe it's a whole class, a whole lecture series to explain it. But there's an idea called, it's known in Hebrew as arvus or arvut, which means, it means like a guarantor. So if I lend you money, I don't know if you'll pay me back, I get a guarantor. That person's on the hook for the loan. That's the idea of a guarantor. But there's a spiritual guarantor. And the Talmud tells us, and again, there's citations for this as well, at Sinai, and again, with the entrance of the people to the land of Israel, when the nation accepted the Torah, they accepted it not just for their own personal requirements to fulfill the Torah, but they each accepted it as a guarantor for every one of the brothers and sisters, descendants, fellow descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Meaning that each one of us is responsible not just for our own righteousness, that we are personally upholding the law, personally exemplifying and embodying the ways of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but we are guarantors for every one of our fellows. Now, there's some halachic ramifications for this. The way it comes up is that, if I made Havdalah after Shabbos, I fulfill my mitzvah to make Havdalah. But you didn't. So if I do my mitzvah, I can't do it a second time because I already fulfilled my mitzvah. I'm not obligated to do it. But if you have not heard Havdalah yet, well, I can make Havdalah a second time to execute or to discharge your responsibility, because your lack of fulfilling this mitzvah is actually my obligation to fulfill the mitzvah. And therefore, if I made Havdalah once, I can make it a second time to help fulfill your mitzvah, because your mitzvah is really my mitzvah. I had the great privilege this morning of wearing my tefillin. An amazing mitzvah. The Torah tells us in 4 places. You should take these citations in the Torah and wrap them and bind them to your heart, to your head. So I fulfill my mitzvah, right? Yeah, well, part of it. The Talmud tells us that I have not just one mitzvah to wear tefillin today. I have, I don't know, how many Jews are there? 600,000? 15 million? Women are obligated, so half of that. 7 million? I have 7 million mitzvahs to wear tefillin today. I did one 7 millionth of my mitzvah I fulfilled. Now we hope that there's others who have done this mitzvah. We hope so. And we imagine so. We know for sure that there are some of these 7 million who did their job on their own. But what percentage of my mitzvah have I fulfilled today? It's a small percentage. This idea is accepted. And therefore, if there's an Esau around who is not behaving properly, it's not just his problem to deal with, it's my problem, it's our problem. Every sin that Esau does, Jacob gets a slice of it. So when we say that there's an imperative to reach out to the Esavs in our life, to help reel them in, to bring them back to righteousness, it's not just a nice thing to help someone else, it's to help yourself. But there's more. There's a lot more. Maybe we should have a whole discussion on the imperative to reach out to our brothers and sisters. Because I have a lot to say. I've assembled a lot of ideas about this. But my favorite teaching of this sort comes from the Chovos Halvavos, Duties of the Heart, which is one of the classic works of self-improvement, of Musar. And it's a very ancient book. It's 800 years old. So it's widely accepted. It's authoritative. He has one sentence in his book that people either they don't know about it. If they know about it, it's a life-altering sentence. He says a person who's completely righteous, completely righteous, they still are not righteous enough to earn a merit in the world to come. Sorry, it's not enough. So how does a person, again, this is someone who's completely righteous, so they do all the mitzvahs and zero of the sins. No sins. Sterling character, flawless, pristine righteousness. It's not enough. How does a person become worthy, meritorious to earn a portion of the world to come? So he says one thing, well, it has to be a gift from God. Okay. But what could we do to earn the world to come? We have to reach out to the Esavs in our life and instruct other people to do the work, to serve God, and to direct other people to be righteous. Because if you don't do that, you're not a candidate for eternity. It's not just some nice thing that we can do because, we want to help, we want to teach others. The Rambam says that if you love God, well, you want to publicize the name of God. That's important, of course. Part of the mitzvah of loving God, which is a mitzvah that is one of the 6 constant mitzvahs. It's a mitzvah that we say in the Shema. Part of that is to promote and publicize and proliferate the name of God in the world. But the Chovos Halvavos says, without reaching out to others and getting others to become righteous, you are not a candidate for eternity. Which is absolutely terrifying because all we're trying to do in this world is to arrive at the ballroom at the end of the corridor as people worthy of Olam Haba. And the Chovos Halvavos says, and I'll give you the citation so you trust me, it's in Shar B'Tachon, in section 4, and if you want to look it up online on the Sefaria, it is in paragraph number 110. Okay, I gave you the sources. Look it up. Tell me if I'm making this up. And the logic that he says is that when you do a mitzvah, you get the reward. When you encourage someone else to do a mitzvah, you get their reward as well. So the amount of reward that you need to earn a ticket, to stamp your ticket to eternity, it's so much you can't possibly earn it on your own. When you act righteously and you encourage others and they act righteously because of your encouragement, well, all that amasses to your account. And that, coupled with your own personal righteousness and with God's benevolence, now you are a candidate. And I'll end with one final point from the Talmud. The Talmud talks about a situation where there was wickedness amongst the people. And God said to the angel, that's it, we're done. Let's punish all the wicked people. I want you to go and point out, separate the righteous from the wicked. Well, how do you do that? Well, you make a sign, a mark on their forehead. If they're righteous, they get a black mark on their forehead. That will protect them. And if they're wicked, they put a drop of blood, a mark of blood on their forehead. That is a sign that they are wicked. So the angel says, wait a minute. The righteous, maybe they were personally righteous, but they did not influence the wicked to become righteous as well. So God responded to the angel, it's true, the wicked were not going to change even if the righteous tried to get them to change. And therefore, yes, they didn't try, but they were a lost cause. I know. God says, I know they were a lost cause. So I'm not going to blame the righteous for not trying to help the wicked, because the wicked were beyond the point of no return. And therefore, I'm not going to penalize the righteous for not trying to help them. And the angel persists and says, wait a minute. You know that. But do they know that? Do the righteous know that they're beyond the point of no return? They don't know that. And therefore, they should have done what they can to help the wicked become righteous. And God says, you know what? You're right. And in that particular instance, the plague that was unleashed, not only did it target the righteous, the so-called righteous, the personally righteous, but actually targeted them first. Why? Because if you don't reach out to Esau, you don't try to help Esau become righteous, that in itself makes you worthy of destruction. It's a Talmud in the book of Shabbos on page 55a. Again, I'm telling this to you so you don't say, oh, Wolb is going off on one of his rants and we could discount him. Look up the sources. Tell me if I'm embellishing it at all. We have to try. Even if it's impossible for us to succeed, the fact that we don't try, that in itself is a condemnation, is a damnation that makes us worthy of punishment. All this should tell us the following idea. It is our responsibility, our requirement. It's imperative. It's incumbent upon us to do whatever we can to not only be personally righteous, but to try to influence others to be righteous. Jacob is held to task on some level that he didn't allow Dina to be taken by Esau, because just maybe, that could have influenced Esau to become righteous. If he did not have to forfeit Dina, he certainly will be required to do whatever he can to bring Esau back to the fold. It's the only way we can end up in paradise, in heaven, in Olam Haba. Our sages tell us, the Chavos HaLevavos tells us, Jacob is judged on his level very, very finely, because he had already advanced up that ladder from the lower Gan Eden, the lower paradise, the upper paradise. He's already been judged on the most subtle and fine points. For us, the lesson is, if we ever encounter an Esau, or any Esau that we know, or anyone that we imagine, even if it's not true, but if we could possibly consider that we can influence them, it is our sacred duty to do so. We have a lot at stake because we are guarantors of their righteousness. And may we all be so fortunate as to redeem or be righteous ourselves, but also help redeem our brothers and sisters that may be very, very far away, and witness the day when the influence of Esau is stamped out and righteousness pervades the land. As water covers the seabed, may it happen swiftly in our days. My email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.